He had a gun pointed at his head before he said a word. No warning, no questions, no hesitation. Just steel, silence, and a man with a badge who thought he owned the block. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to know, was that the man he just threatened was a decorated Special Forces operative, trained in combat, skilled in restraint, and packing more discipline than anyone in this godforsaken subdivision could comprehend. And me? I watched from the porch as my son, birdseed still in hand, smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind that sends chills crawling down your spine. Red Maple Grove wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a retirement mirage designed for middle-class serenity, rows of identical houses, postage stamp lawns, and rules so specific that you needed approval to paint your mailbox. We bought into it like everyone else. The promise of peace, potlucks, and cul-de-sacs. My husband and I had just retired, packed up decades of noise and stress, and found ourselves drawn to the brochure's seductive pitch, a quiet place to thrive. The first few months were blissfully uneventful. There were coffee mornings, awkward smiles from neighbors, and the sound of sprinklers hissing under streetlights. It felt like living inside a suburban snow globe. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, cracks began to show. The HOA, 3 letters we thought meant little more than lawn etiquette, started to feel like a regime. At first, it was a note about our flagpole being an inch too tall. Then a $50 fine for a garden gnome named Rupert who disrupted visual continuity. It seemed laughable. We joked about HOA laws and their clipboard warriors. But we weren't laughing when the fines began piling up like autumn leaves, or when a woman named Karen, with a smile that could sharpen pencils, showed up with a tape measure and a glint in her eye. His name was Randy. Nobody knew his last name. Just Randy. A part-time sheriff's deputy who moved into Red Maple Grove a few months after Karen's ascension to HOA president, a role she'd acquired without opposition and fortified with her own rewritten bylaws. Randy was Karen's boyfriend, or maybe her enforcer. Hard to tell. He wasn't on the HOA board. Not officially, but he patrolled the sidewalks like he owned every blade of grass. He wore his badge like a trophy and his mirrored sunglasses like a shield. You'd think he was guarding a military compound, not checking for non-regulation patio furniture. He was the type who introduced himself by citing noise ordinances, who asked about your trash can placement before your name. He'd drive slowly down the block in his cruiser, windows rolled halfway, one arm on the door, scanning houses like they were suspects in a lineup. And Karen? She followed behind with her clipboard, nodding. They called it beautification enforcement. We called it something else entirely. Jason came home on a Thursday. No fanfare, no announcement, just the soft hum of his F-250 pulling into our driveway at 11:42 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was still awake, nursing chamomile tea and a half-written letter I'd never send. He stepped out of the truck, like a ghost sliding back into his old life. The porch light caught the edge of his duffel bag, worn from years of travel, and I saw the scar on his forearm peeking beneath the sleeve. "Hi, Ma," he said, and that was all. Jason had served 4 tours in some of the world's darkest corners. He didn't talk much about it, never needed to. The way he moved said enough, precise, measured, always alert. But here, in Red Maple Grove, I hoped he could finally exhale. He deserved mornings with black coffee and birdsong, not roadside IEDs and encrypted radio calls. We stayed up late that night. He told me he wanted to relax for a while, maybe fix up the garage, and watch the Blue Jays return to the oak tree out front. We even joked about hanging a bird feeder. But the next morning, I saw Karen's minivan slow in front of the house. She stared. Jason waved. She did not. The war had followed him home, just in a different uniform. The first shot across the bow came less than 48 hours later. Jason had left his truck parked in the driveway, well within our property line. But when the sun rose, a neon orange citation was already tucked under the windshield wiper. HOA Code 7.1A, vehicle overhang beyond approved limit. The offense? His front tires edged 2 inches over the sidewalk curb. Jason read the ticket in silence. I waited for him to swear, to react, to say anything, but he just folded the paper and placed it on the kitchen counter, Later that evening, as twilight smeared across the rooftops, Randy showed up. He didn't knock, just stood at the foot of the driveway like a rattlesnake in press khakis. "You the guy with the truck?" he asked, eyes hidden behind those damn sunglasses, even though the sun had already dipped. Jason walked down the steps slowly, hands visible. "Yes, sir," he said. "You can't park it here. Violates HOA ordinances." Jason tilted his head. "It's on private property." Randy stepped closer. "It's technically common property if it crosses the curb." They were just inches apart now. The air had shifted, tightened. I moved to the door, ready to intervene, but Jason lifted one hand. Subtle, a signal that he had it under control. He asked calmly, "Are you here as HOA or as law enforcement?" Randy's nostrils flared. "Does it matter?" "It does if you're armed," Jason replied, voice smooth as glass. The silence that followed could have cracked stone. The third night, the storm broke. Jason was on the lawn, installing the bird feeder like we'd planned. He held a pouch of seed in one hand, the metal hook in the other, when Karen marched down the sidewalk. Randy followed close behind, hand on his belt. "You're in violation of Code 6.8b, Karen barked, clipboard raised like a holy text. "Unauthorized wildlife attraction devices." Jason turned slowly. "You serious?" Randy's hand moved to his hip, and then, without a word, he drew his weapon. It was like time shattered. I dropped my watering can. Jason didn't move. He just looked at Randy, a stillness in his eyes that said, "I've seen worse, and I've survived better." Karen grinned behind him, smug and victorious. But what neither of them knew, what they couldn't know, was that every movement, every breath of that confrontation was being recorded. Doorbell cam, Jason's chest cam. Even the Johnsons across the street were filming from behind their curtains. Jason smiled then, not kindly, the kind of smile that says, "You just walked into a trap." The gun didn't shake. That was the part that haunted me. Not Randy's arrogance, not the cold steel pointed at my son, but the stillness, the certainty. This wasn't a threat. It was a decision, one heartbeat away from something irreversible. And Jason? He didn't blink. But I knew that look, the coiled silence. The one he wore before breaching doorways in enemy territory. The one he wore before pulling a trigger that changed everything. The bird feeder still swayed gently behind him, like some innocent flag of war. That was the moment I realized we were already under siege. Randy didn't load a weapon, not even when Jason calmly announced, "You're being recorded from 3 angles. This is your last warning." There was a flicker in Randy's expression, something primal, like the moment an animal realizes it's not the predator in the room. His fingers didn't twitch, but his confidence did. Karen, a few feet back, noticed it too. "Randy," she hissed, "just sight him." Too late. Neighbors had begun filtering out, drawn by the sirens of conflict. Curtains fluttered. Cell phones were lifted. A dog barked in the distance. Max, our arthritic retriever, growling low from the porch. Jason didn't move. His voice cut through the summer air like a blade. "You're not law enforcement here. Not anymore. You're trespassing. Armed." Randy faltered. The badge on his chest felt suddenly small. Insufficient. I stepped forward, heart pounding, shouting now. "Put the gun down." It was the sound of a cruiser pulling up that finally broke the moment. Real deputies. Flashing lights. Authority that actually mattered. Within seconds, the standoff turned procedural. Officers separating parties. Neighbors giving statements. Randy's hand forced back toward a holster with a face like curdled milk. Karen tried to spin it. It was for safety. He was aggressive. But Jason had said nothing aggressive. Hadn't moved an inch. The only thing aggressive was the weapon, still warm from Randy's palm. And now, the real question hung in the air like smoke. What happens when a man with a badge abuses it on camera? The formal report was taken on our porch. I sat on the edge of the steps, gripping a cold glass of tea I hadn't touched in an hour. My husband, quiet as ever, stood behind me, one hand on my shoulder. Jason gave his statement in that same level tone. Precise, controlled. It was the voice of someone trained to keep his heart rate steady, even with a loaded weapon inches from his face. He didn't identify himself as law enforcement, Jason said. He issued no verbal commands. He raised his firearm at close range and did not articulate a threat. The officer writing nodded slowly, lips tight. "You carrying?" Jason nodded, producing his permit. "Legally." Weapon remained holstered. Another officer, younger, watched the footage on Jason's chest cam. His expression darkened with every second. Karen hovered nearby, trying to interject. He intimidated Randy. He had a bird feeder. No one laughed. This wasn't funny anymore. The footage was damning. Jason, calm. Randy, escalating. Karen, smirking in the background. And the gun. Always the gun. We learned that night Randy wasn't just a deputy. He was on probation. A previous excessive force complaint. Nothing proven. Nothing public. But whispers circulated quickly once the badge came off. When he pulled that weapon on our lawn, he didn't just cross a line. He detonated it. They say discipline is what you do under pressure. That night, Jason redefined the word. I asked him later, as we sat in the garage and the adrenaline began to ebb, how he stayed so still. Muscle memory. He said, "You only move when it's worth it." He wasn't. But I saw the truth in his eyes. The restraint had cost him. His hands, now unclenched, bore half-moons where his nails had bit skin. He'd stood there waiting, calculating threat vectors, escape routes, collateral damage. He could have taken Randy down in less than a second. Disarm, dislocate, incapacitate. But he didn't. Not on our lawn. Not with his mother watching. Instead, he stood his ground like the soldier he was. Not with bullets. With backbone. Neighbors started texting that night. Videos were being shared. People who once hid behind curtains began asking questions. Not about the bird feeder, but about Randy, about Karen, about power and how it had gone unchecked for too long. The next day, Jason mowed the lawn like nothing happened. But I watched him carefully. The calm wasn't for him. It was for us. We learned later that Randy never even called in the incident. He hadn't notified dispatch, hadn't logged the stop. As far as his apartment was concerned, he was off duty, out of jurisdiction, and out of control. And Jason? He still hadn't revealed who he was. To the neighbors, he was just my quiet son, the one who helped me carry groceries, the one who fixed the porch swing last summer. But beneath that calm surface was a man who defused bombs and stared down insurgents. And now, he was being treated like a criminal for hanging a bird feeder. I asked him why he didn't tell the officers that night. He shrugged. Didn't need to. Facts spoke louder. But I knew better. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting the idea of fairness. If you need a military record to be treated with respect in your own neighborhood, then we've already lost. Still, that decision would soon become a turning point. Because once the HOA caught wind that Jason wasn't some average citizen, they realized they woke in something they couldn't put back to sleep. Later that week, I met a man I hadn't seen in years. My husband, not the retiree who tended hedges and fixed sprinklers. The man, the one who taught Jason how to use a compass and disassemble a rifle before he was 15. He sat across from Jason at the kitchen table, silent, listening to every detail. When the story was done, he didn't say much. Just, "You handled it right. Proud of you." Then he turned to me. "We're not letting this slide." It was the first time I realized this wasn't just about Jason anymore. It wasn't even about Randy or Karen. It was about every neighbor who'd been fined, intimidated, silenced. About every fake vote, every forged proxy, every backyard shed cited into oblivion. The line had been drawn. And this time, it wasn't with chalk. It was with the calm precision of a man who'd learned that some wars don't start with bullets. They start with a clipboard and a nameplate. Jason stood, eyes sharp. They think this is over. They're wrong. And just like that, the battle for Red Maple Grove had truly begun. Jason stood at the edge of the neighborhood watch board's monthly meeting, hands behind his back, unmoving. Karen was already mid-sentence, blabbering about community pride and maintaining aesthetic standards, when her voice cracked slightly. She'd seen him. Randy wasn't there. Jason stepped forward, slow, deliberate, a folder in one hand, a flash drive in the other. "Before we begin," he said, voice steady and loud enough to silence everyone, "there's something you should all see." The room hushed. The screen flickered to life. And for the first time in HOA history, Truth walked into the boardroom wearing combat boots. Jason didn't just show up that day. He made a statement. Karen, now visibly uncomfortable, attempted to laugh it off when she realized what was playing on the projection screen. Body cam footage. Randy's gun, Jason's comm. The unmistakable voice of Karen giggling in the background, like it was all some sick joke. The room froze. For too long, the HOA meetings have been echo chambers of unchecked authority. Jason shattered that illusion like glass. "What you just saw," he said evenly, "is what happens when a private citizen gets targeted by someone who thinks a uniform makes him invincible. But I'm not easily intimidated." He placed a folder on the table. Inside, HOA bylaws, photos, signed statements from neighbors, a copy of his incident report. "I've submitted a formal grievance," he added, "and I'll be attending every board meeting from here on, watching, listening, holding you all accountable." No one spoke. Karen's mascara looked like it might run. A board member to her left cleared his throat and adjusted his collar. Jason smiled. Meeting adjourned? No one stopped him as he walked out. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. He had something they'd never expected: proof, poise, and purpose. Over the next few days, Jason began gathering intel like it was a military recon op. He didn't knock on doors or wave documents. He simply listened. Miss Clara from 3 houses down told him how Karen once fined her for unauthorized wind chimes her late husband had given her before passing. The Bentleys on Lot 22 had been mysteriously overcharged dues for 3 years, always with the same vague accounting adjustment excuse. And old Mr. Henley, a disabled veteran, had been denied his porch ramp twice for not submitting the correct form, though he'd sent it in 3 times. Jason created a spreadsheet, a digital map, a paper trail. He traced fines, forged votes, HOA reimbursements for services provided by companies Randy owned under shell names. He collected voice memos, security camera stills, even a trash bag Karen accidentally tossed with shredded HOA ballots from last spring's vote. He wasn't loud. He was lethal. Every keystroke was a bullet, every folder a minefield. And the best part? They had no idea. By the next week, Karen realized something was wrong. She tried her usual tactics. A sweet smiling email to the community with pastel fonts and cheerful phrasing. "Let's celebrate our red maple family." But it felt fake, desperate. She cornered my husband during a walk. "I just want to smooth things over. Maybe we all overreacted." He didn't reply, just kept walking. Then she tried the neighbors, offering wave fines, quick approvals, smiling like a car salesman with a quota. But Jason's story had already spread. When she attempted a closed-door board meeting to discuss security concerns, Jason showed up with a printed copy of the HOA bylaws. "This meeting isn't compliant with transparency policy," he said flatly. "I'll wait outside, but I've got questions ready." The board members began to fracture. One quietly left that night and never returned. Another emailed Jason privately, admitting he'd been coerced into approving decisions under threat of legal action. Karen was unraveling, and Jason wasn't even breaking a sweat. Cornered animals get dangerous. Soon, the retaliation began. We received a violation notice for a supposed improperly stored garden hose. It was coiled on a hook, exactly as outlined in the manual. Jason just smiled. "They're getting sloppy." Then came the anonymous complaint about frequent loud visitors, except no one had visited us. A week later, we got a letter citing us for overgrown shrubs. The same week, a landscaper Karen hired, without our consent, showed up to remedy the issue and left us a $140 invoice. Jason paid it. Then he subpoenaed the HOA's external vendor records. Meanwhile, the neighbors began to stir. The Holtz family got cited for excess recycling bin usage. 3 residents had checks mysteriously go missing, resulting in late fees. Jason compiled it all. At night, his office light glowed like a war room, red string on a map. Files. Case IDs. A USB drive titled Final Strike. I asked him what it all meant. Pressure, he said. They can't stand it. Let's see who cracks first. Despite the increasing attacks, Jason never raised his voice, never slammed a door, never threw a threat, but he was everywhere, at every meeting, on every compliance report, responding to every citation with full documentation, CCing legal advisors, copying neighbors. He made the HOA play by their own rule book, and they hated it. Karen's smiles vanished. Randy disappeared entirely. Whispers grew louder. Someone anonymously slid an envelope into our mailbox with old board meeting transcripts, signed votes Karen had forged. Jason reviewed them in silence, face unreadable. That night, he stood in our backyard, the bird feeder gently swaying in the breeze. They think silence means fear, he said. But it doesn't. It means patience. And in that quiet moment, beneath the same tree where it all began, I realized something. This wasn't just a fight about power. It was a fight for peace. And Jason was going to win it without firing a single shot. Jason dropped the envelope onto the coffee table. It slid open. 3 forged signatures, HOA board letters, and a bank transaction log in Karen's name. Thousands funneled into a private account labeled Community Beautification Initiative. He didn't flinch. But when I looked up, his hands were shaking. Not from fear, from restraint. They buried it, he whispered. They buried it all, but it's coming back up. And when truth claws out of the dirt, it drags everyone with it. Jason didn't go to war with noise. He used precision, using his private investigator's license. He began compiling a case strong enough to cut through the HOA's layers of bureaucracy like wire through butter. Every citation, every fine, every anonymous complaint went into a timeline that painted a terrifyingly clear picture. Targeted harassment disguised as regulation. He secured affidavits from residents. Some were hesitant at first, fearing retribution, but Jason's quiet confidence made them brave. His calmness was contagious. He called in a favor from an old friend, Juliana Myers, a real estate attorney turned HOA reform advocate. When she saw the documentation, she leaned back in her chair and whispered, "This isn't just misconduct. This is criminal enterprise." Together, they assembled a complaint to the State Oversight Board and drafted a federal civil rights suit. Every form was filled, every claim substantiated. They weren't just exposing Karen and Randy. They were burning the blueprint of HOA corruption. Still, Jason said nothing publicly. He wanted them to believe they were safe. Right until the floor gave out beneath them, Karen sensed it. Control slipping like sand through her fingers. Her once flawless meetings began to fracture. Motions she proposed were met with silence. Board members glanced nervously, no longer parroting her words. Then came the community newsletter, anonymous at first, but expertly written and filled with specific examples of abuses. It was everywhere. Mailboxes, email inboxes, printed out and left in the dog park. One page read, "You are not alone. They built a cage around you, but the key was always in your pocket." Karen called an emergency board meeting. Only 2 members showed. She sent out a desperate letter, claiming outside agitators were spreading false narratives. But her paranoia made her sloppy. At the next HOA meeting, Jason brought a camera, legally permitted. She objected. "My rights are public on public ground," he said simply, "and I want everything documented." Half the neighborhood showed up that night, quiet, watching. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to assert control, but the power had shifted. It wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the people watching. It started with Mr. Henley. He stood up, cane in hand, and recounted how the HOA denied him access to a wheelchair ramp for over a year, causing him to fall twice. Then the Bentleys shared their story of 3 years of overpayments. Then a quiet woman in the back, Melissa, told everyone how Randy screamed at her 14-year-old daughter for riding a bike without a reflector, then fined him $75. Every voice was a wound opening under Karen's smile. Jason sat silently in the second row, arms crossed, listening. Not one word from him. But the tremor in Karen's hand grew with every testimony. Then Juliana stepped forward, and handed her a copy of the formal civil complaint. Karen's mouth moved, but no sound came out. "I suggest you review this with your attorney," Juliana said. "You're being sued. Multiple parties. Federal level." Karen's chair creaked as she sat down heavily. The meeting ended in stunned silence. And outside, under the dim glow of the street lamp, someone whispered, "It's over." The next morning, Jason submitted everything. Digital files to the State HOA Oversight Bureau, copies to local law enforcement, a detailed report to the FBI, complete with financial records, witness statements, and Randy's fake security license, which, as it turned out, expired 4 years ago. Within 48 hours, state officials acknowledged receipt. A week later, an agent knocked on our door, asking if Jason would consent to a formal deposition. He nodded once. "Been ready?" Karen received her notice the same day. Soon, agents were visiting homes across Red Maple Grove, gathering statements, verifying transactions. HOA funds had been funneled into consulting firms that didn't exist, shell accounts created by Karen and signed off by Randy. Jason's final blow came quietly. A thumb drive labeled Truth, delivered to every board member, local journalist, and even the mayor's office. On it, a 20-minute video detailing the corruption, the manipulation, the financial abuse. By the time it was over, Karen's name was mud, Randy was nowhere to be found, and the HOA office had been closed for emergency review. In a last-ditch effort to survive, Karen panicked. A neighbor spotted her shredding documents in the HOA clubhouse late at night. Bags of paper, some still marked confidential. Jason, already expecting this, had filed a preservation request days earlier and contacted law enforcement. A patrol unit arrived to find Karen desperately trying to erase years of misconduct. They didn't stop her. They filmed her. Within an hour, she was under investigation for destruction of public records. Randy's car was found abandoned in a parking lot 2 towns over. Keys still in the ignition. He'd vanished completely. Rumors swirled about an unpaid debt, an offshore account, even ties to a private security firm caught laundering HOA funds elsewhere. But Jason? He just waited. And when the news finally broke, he didn't gloat, didn't post, didn't brag. He just turned to me and said, "It had to be done." They built their power on silence. We destroyed it with the truth. And in that moment, Red Maple Grove breathed again. The power went out at exactly 3:17 a.m. Not a flicker. A hard kill. Jason was already up, seated in the dark with a tactical flashlight and his sidearm resting beside him. Through the blinds, he watched a black SUV idle, without headlights at the corner of Red Maple and Briarway. 30 seconds passed. Then the front door camera blinked once. Before going dead, he didn't speak, just stood and muttered, "They're not done." Because when you burn a crooked empire to ground, sometimes the ashes crawl back for revenge. Though Karen and Randy were exposed, their influence didn't die quietly. Some of the most zealous loyalists, board appointees, silent enforcers, and rule sticklers who benefited from favoritism, began lashing out. One neighbor, Mr. Goldstein, filed 3 noise complaints against Jason in 1 week, each citing suspicious activity. All were false. Trash was dumped on Jason's lawn. His mailbox was smashed. Security footage showed a masked figure with gloves, caught just before the power cut. But Jason was prepared. He installed solar-powered backups, secured all entries with motion alerts, and kept the body cam running any time he stepped outside. Then came the most chilling move, a fabricated anonymous tip sent to Child Protective Services, claiming Jason kept military-grade weapons accessible to minors. CPS arrived unannounced, only to leave apologetically when they saw the secure gun safes, the spotless home, and the service medals on the mantel. Jason didn't retaliate. He documented everything, because he knew retaliation only works when the truth hasn't already flooded the room. A local journalist digging into the HOA corruption filed a FOIA request on Jason. What she found shocked even her editors. Jason wasn't just former military. He was special reconnaissance, black ops, 5 years deployed, 2 commendations for acts of valor, and 1 classified extraction credited with preventing a political coup abroad. Most of his file was redacted. The article titled, "HOA Bullies the Wrong Man," went viral. Jason became a symbol, Not because he bragged, but because he never asked to be a symbol at all. Reporters camped at the gate. Strangers left thank you notes on the sidewalk. Veterans from other neighborhoods reached out, inspired by his restraint and grit. He didn't smile for cameras, didn't hold press conferences. He just said, "I came home to find peace. They brought war. I defended peace again." The HOA loyalists went silent, because when the world knows you're the one who walks through fire without blinking, even cowards think twice about lighting a match. Fueled by Jason's evidence and the public outcry, the State Department of Housing and Community Development opened a full investigation into Red Maple Grove's HOA practices. Investigators arrived unannounced. They froze all board assets. Subpoenas were issued, bank records dissected. Every fine issued in the last 3 years was audited. Former residents, those who had been bullied into selling their homes under pressure, were contacted for testimony. A bombshell emerged. Red Maple Grove wasn't an isolated case. Karen had been on advisory panels in 2 other neighborhoods before, both of which had similar financial discrepancies and sudden resignations. The investigation broadened. Jason, now working quietly with legal counsel, became a formal liaison for resident testimony. He ensured anonymity for the fearful and clarity for the confused. HOAs across the state trembled, because this wasn't just a lawsuit anymore, it was a movement. And it started on one street, with one man who said, "No more." The state referred the most damning findings to the FBI, specifically the shell accounts, falsified contractor records, and evidence of mail fraud. Karen's beautification firm, which had received over $280,000 in 3 years, didn't exist. The address led to a closed dry cleaner. Signatures approving payments were forged. Randy had signed off as head of security, despite never holding a state-recognized credential. The FBI traced multiple payments to offshore accounts registered in Belize and the Cayman Islands. A warrant was issued for Randy, still missing. Kara was placed under house arrest, her assets frozen, her passport seized. Federal agents interviewed Jason for over 4 hours. When asked how he suspected the extent of fraud so early, Jason replied simply, "It smelled like a military op, tight control, information suppression, centralized command. That's not neighborhood management. That's tactical subjugation." The agents nodded. What they thought would be a simple HOA fraud case was unraveling into something deeper, something with shadows. With the old HOA disbanded and under investigation, a temporary steering committee was formed. Volunteers from the community, including a retired judge, a school principal, and, reluctantly, Jason. He didn't want the seat, but the people demanded it. Under their new bylaws, no fines could be issued without clear evidence and due process. All financials were posted monthly. Board meetings were live-streamed and recorded. The neighborhood changed, not overnight, but steadily. Neighbors who had stopped talking to each other began to gather again. The playground was rebuilt. Fences were mended, not just physically, but in spirit. One Sunday, during a block cleanup event, I found Jason standing beside the rebuilt clubhouse. He watched kids draw chalk murals on the sidewalk. One wrote, "Welcome to Freedom Lane." I nudged him, not the name of the street. He smiled faintly. Maybe it should be. For the first time in months, I saw his shoulders drop. The war was over. But the peace, that was just beginning. Jason was planting a tree the morning the call came in. The soil was rich. The sun was soft. For once, his hands weren't on a weapon, just roots and earth. The voice on the phone was gravelly, anonymous, scrambled through a modulator. "We know what you did to Karen and Randy," it said. "You cost a lot of people money." Pause. "But you didn't get all of us. And some of us are much closer than you think." The line went dead. Jason didn't move. He just stared at the small oak in his hand. Because some roots don't grow into the light. Some rot in the dark. And this war wasn't over. As the state and FBI investigations deepened, patterns emerged. Red Maple Grove wasn't the only neighborhood where HOA abuse had spiraled into criminal activity. 10 other developments across the state, and 3 more across state lines, were found using the same third-party consulting firm that Karen had funneled funds through. All operated under different names but shared corporate backers. Investigators dubbed it Operation Suburban Silence. Jason, now reluctantly recognized as the whistleblower who lit the spark, was invited to testify in front of a federal committee. He spoke clearly, calmly, factually, but it wasn't his words that made headlines. It was the closing line of his statement. We train for combat in foreign lands. We never imagined the battle for freedom would start over a mailbox at home. That sentence went viral. Thousands of others, veterans, homeowners, whistleblowers, came forward with their own stories. Jason hadn't just uncovered a scam. He had accidentally kicked open the door to a national reckoning. After his testimony, Jason was approached by a quiet, suited man from the Department of Justice. The offer was unofficial, but very real. A task force was being formed, one with authority to investigate systemic abuse in residential governance across the U.S. They wanted Jason to serve as a senior advisor. He initially declined. "I'm not a politician," he said. "I just wanted to be left alone." But it wasn't politics they needed. It was precision, truth, a warrior who understood how civilian systems could be corrupted with the same tactics used by insurgents. Fear, disinformation, coercion. After days of thought and encouragement of the very neighbors he once distrusted, Jason agreed. He wouldn't carry a badge, but he would carry a pen. And sometimes that's the more dangerous weapon. Facing federal charges, Karen began to panic. From her monitored home, she instructed her attorney to open negotiations. She offered names, real estate agents, state inspectors, even low-level city council members who had profited from her backroom deals. She claimed Randy had been just the enforcer, not the mastermind. But one name stood out. A retired senator, now head of a private equity group, who'd invested heavily in planned community initiatives. The prosecution paused. They dug deeper and found that Red Maple Grove had been a pilot project, a test case for scalable, quiet governance, where communities could be controlled not through democracy, but soft authoritarianism disguised as local order. Karen, in a last bid for leniency, handed over hard drives, emails, transaction logs. It didn't save her from prison, but it exposed a rot. Jason was handed one of the decrypted files. It was titled Normalization Protocols, Phase 2. The manhunt for Randy had gone cold, until a tip came from Guatemala. Interpol flagged a passport photo that matched Randy with a fake identity. He was working security at a luxury compound linked to the same equity firm Karen had implicated. Within weeks, a joint operation between U.S. Marshals and Guatemalan Special Forces brought him in. Jason watched the footage of the extraction. Randy didn't resist. He looked relieved. Back in the U.S., he was arraigned under federal racketeering and wire fraud statutes. When asked if he wanted to speak to Jason, he only said, "I wasn't afraid of the law. I was afraid of him. He's not just a soldier. He's the reason we lost." Jason declined to meet, not out of hate, but because this war no longer deserved his energy. Justice had found its way. With the final arrest made and the task force operational, Jason was offered everything from book deals to a Netflix documentary. He declined them all. Instead, he returned to where it started, Red Maple Grove. The neighborhood was healing. Gardens bloomed again. Flags flew not in protest, but in pride. He spent mornings working with local teens on security tech skills, taught kids how to program motion sensors and build solar rigs, helped restore the community center with his own hands. And on one crisp autumn evening, as the neighborhood held a barbecue, a little girl tugged at his sleeve. "Are you the soldier man?" Jason kneeled. "I used to be." She handed him a drawing. It showed him standing in front of a house, arms out with shadows behind him and sunshine in front. He looked at her. "And now," she smiled, "you're the guardian." Jason looked up at the stars. There was no ceremony, no parade, just peace. And finally, after everything, he could sleep.